Hello, friends. I'm your host, Dave Layton, and welcome to Signs of Our Time, discovering America's heritage one sign at a time. This podcast is designed to provide the story behind the story found on America's roadside historical signs. There are many different types of historical markers scattered across the United States. But perhaps the most common type is one that you might not think of as a historical marker. But tombstones or burial stones are historical markers. They range from a simple stone marker to elaborate works of art. There are probably, and it's only speculation on my part, but there are probably more unmarked gravestones than the type we normally think of. Again, that's just speculation on my part. I think of the countless people that died in the development of our great nation. I think of those who traveled through wilderness areas to settle our land and were buried in unmarked graves. It was very common for slaves during the period of slavery in our nation to be buried in unmarked graves, or if there was a gravestone, it was usually a simple one with only their first name and maybe the last name of their master. I recall during the time I was stationed at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, the Air Force wanted to extend the runway, but there was an old cemetery from the Civil War period that was in the pathway of where the runway was going to be built. An archaeologist was hired to study the cemetery. It was discovered that there were several unmarked graves, probably belonging to slaves that had been buried there. The Air Force exhumed the graves and reburied the remains with full military honors. Well, since this is the Halloween season, I thought it seemed fitting to share a spooky story, completely fictitious, but one that involves an unmarked grave. I wrote this story for my granddaughters that live in Red Bank, Mississippi. This is the story of Old Walking Joe. Most of us don't think too much beyond the noise of a train as it passes in the night. We might hear, but soon dismiss it as another sound in the night. To those living around the small, sleepy community of Red Bank, Mississippi, the train's long, lonesome whistle and rumbling wheels bring mystery and sadness. The old-timers remember an event that forever changed their thoughts when they hear the train, especially on deep, dark nights. As the story goes, one moonless night in late spring, long after sunset, an old black man known to the locals as Walking Joe was returning home from helping a neighbor with farm chores. He decided to take a shortcut that would take him walking alongside the railroad tracks that wound their way through the deep woods. With only a dim kerosene lantern, he made his way through the gathering evening mist. As he walked along the rails, he was careful not to trip on the cross ties. Well, at first, the only sound he could hear was a faraway barking dog. But things soon changed. As he continued down the tracks, he heard the distant sound of the train's lonesome whistle coming from behind. Joe knew there was still a way to go before he made it to the railroad crossing where he could safely leave the tracks. He continued walking along the tracks, but began to walk faster. And as he carefully watched his steps, he didn't think about the rapidly approaching train. Suddenly, the train gave out a loud blast on the whistle, and Joe realized that the train was close. He began to run in a desperate attempt to get off the tracks and away from the onrushing train. Then, as the tracks began to curve not far from the railroad crossing, Joe tripped and fell. As he tried to get up, he was struck by the train and killed. The next day, a railway maintenance crew discovered only his tattered body and the shattered lantern. Later, during the investigation, The train engineer explained that he didn't see a light or anyone on the tracks, only the distant flashing lights of the railroad crossing. Joe was buried among the unmarked graves in the Red Bank Cemetery, not far from the tracks, and the event was soon forgotten. Then the stories began, mostly among those living close to the tracks. On deep, dark, moonless nights, as the train makes its way, some have reported seeing the light that looks like a swinging lantern moving quickly down the tracks. Then, as the train approaches, the light disappears, and they hear a man scream. Could it be old Walking Joe? No one knows. Maybe it's the distant glow of car headlights or the wail of a disturbed nocturnal animal. Or maybe it's old Walking Joe trying desperately to escape the oncoming train. Well, if you find yourself in Red Bank, Mississippi on a deep, dark, moonless night, you might look over at the train track to see if you can catch a glimpse of old Walking Joe and his swinging lantern. Well, friends, there you have it. A departure from my usual episodes about historical markers. I hope you enjoyed it. I invite you to subscribe and continue listening as we bring more episodes about the rich heritage of our great nation. Please share this podcast with others. If you have interesting stories about historical signs and markers, email me at americanhistoricalmarkers@gmail.com. That's americanhistoricalmarkers@gmail.com. Maybe your story behind the story will be featured. I'm your host, Dave Layton, and thank you for listening, and safe travels.